as you've been so wonderfully polite and gone quiet, normally I get used to studying in front of students for about 10 minutes. Okay, shh. You all behave wonderfully well. My name is Jeremy Jennings, and I'm a professor in the School of Politics and International Relations, and it's my great privilege to welcome you all here this evening for the second of these lectures that we're staging, Michael Quinlan lectures. And it was a great honour for us this evening to have such a distinguished guest. I'm going to hand over shortly to Sir Kevin Tebbit to make the introductions, and Sir Kevin will be the master of ceremonies this evening. There will be time for questions afterwards, and so on. So we're delighted to have you here, and thank you very much for coming. I'm sure that many of you have been to these Marlene Group events before. I think this is the 82nd. This is MEG82. So it's been going for quite a long while. And I think it's immensely successful, but I think the general purpose, really, of these occasions is to try and bring together the two worlds of academia and, in a sense, the world of practice, be it civil service, diplomacy, government, or whatever it might be, and it does that with great success. It's a very busy period the next few weeks for the Marlene Group. In addition to tonight's lecture on June the 13th, we have our very own Professor Pete Hennessy, Lord Hennessy, will be launching his next book here. That'll be on June the 13th. And then the following week, on June the 20th, we will be launching, or launched here will be the next installment of Alistair Campbell's Diaries, which should be a fun event. So that'll be in say June the 20th. So lots of things going on, and if you've not been before, we sincerely hope you'll come back again. You might ask, why am I making the introduction? Well, I think the truth of the matter is we paid for it. That is true. It's true. Now, so this is now, but also I want to make a more general point, which is that we rely heavily upon the long-term sponsorship of Hewlett-Packard, and we're always grateful for the support they give the Marlene Group. Without them, I don't think we could operate in anywhere near the way that we do, and with such success and with such prestige. On the other hand, my school, the paying for it is that we are also part sponsors this evening. So this is costing a lot per minute to have me standing here. But why am I? The serious point is this: like many of this, I mean, some of you obviously are from Queen Mary, some of you are not. Like many of the schools within Queen Mary, which, as you probably know, recently accepted them into the Russell Group and so on. It's been a very successful period for Queen Mary these last few years. And part of that, a lot of schools have expanded. And our school, the School of Politics and International Relations, is one of those schools that has expanded. And under the chairmanship of our present head of school, Professor Ray Kiley, who's momentarily detained in a vitally important meeting over in the Queen's Building, which is intent on getting out of as quick as he can. Under Ray's leadership, one of the things we've done is expand very significantly in the field of international relations. It's a field which, on the whole, we didn't have much expertise in before, but we've developed that expertise, and I think with great success. And it's therefore one of the reasons why we were so eager to be involved this evening and have such a distinguished guest, is because we have invested heavily in the field of study of international relations, and therefore to have such a distinguished scholar as yourself is in a sense is exactly what we want to do in terms of a school and working in that field. So once again, thank you very, very much for coming. I want now to hand over to Sir Kevin, and just a brief to indicate something about Sir Kevin, who's joined the Ministry of Defence in, I think, 1969, the glory days of Harold Wilson's premiership. And later on, he moved to the Foreign Office. Long list of achievements, many achievements. He served in Turkey, he served in Washington, D.C. He worked very, very closely with Lord Carrington when he was Director General of NATO, I believe. A whole series of very prestigious roles which he continued to perform until his retirement in I think, 2005. In other words, there can be no better person to introduce our distinguished guest than Sir Kevin, who knows the field of international policy making and so on as well as anyone. The last thing I would say is to also point out that Sir Kevin is a visiting professor here at Queen Mary, visiting professor in the School of History. And I've already mentioned some of the events which will be taking place in the month of June, but a further event which will be taking place, and I think it's July the 2nd, is Sir Kevin himself will be one of the speakers, when I think will be MEG85, I think, 85. So as you see, we have a very distinguished chair this evening, but also, again, someone we're very appreciative of the fact that he has such close links with Queen Mary. So Kevin, over to you.
Thanks.
And thanks very much indeed.
Now, I could be one of a very large number of people who would have wanted to have introduced this evening's event. As you know, Michael Quinlan was taken away from us far too early, and it was considered very important that his contribution to knowledge, scholarship, and indeed to ethics should be remembered and commemorated and live actively on. Hence, this series of lectures. This is the second of those lectures. Michael spent his life trying to help society understand and manage hard power in the nuclear age in particular, and in understanding and helping others understand how to regulate that and manage it using his deep grounding in ethics that came to him as a schoolboy and continued with him throughout his life. And I think few people may know just how much work Michael did as he went through his life, corresponding particularly with church leaders on the ethics of those issues that many of us know more superficially as nuclear deterrence and how to manage the world at a time of mutual assured destruction. So it's a great pleasure to see now the living carrying forward of that great tradition, and we're very proud to have Mary Quinlan and her family in the front row here. With this second lecture with Professor Joseph Nye, the second reason why many of us would have wanted to have introduced this, because he, as you know, is an internationally renowned figure who probably is the greatest power broker of all, having discussed power in all its dimensions. Harvard University Distinguished Service Professor, former Dean of the Kennedy School, served variously at high levels in the US government as Assistant Secretary of Defense for International Security Affairs, Chair of the National Intelligence Council, Deputy Undersecretary of State for Security Assistance, Science and Technology. And you will know him particularly, I think, for his book in 2004 on soft power, The Means to Success in World Politics, Understanding International Conflict. In fact, I think he coined that term much earlier than that, and throughout most of my career, he was the person associated with the softer version of what we ourselves were struggling with, which was usually the harder end of the spectrum. 2008, he wrote the book The Powers to Lead, and in 2011, The Future of Power. And I think his main theme and contribution to scholarship has been around the principle that while force remains important in global politics, getting people to want what you want is much more effective. And as we see the great power blocks no longer, as it were, running things in the way they could in the past, and all sorts of asymmetric power risks emerging with non-state actors, with cyber war and that type of thing, getting people on your side is going to become much more important, I suspect, in the future than simply the deterrence that most of us understood in the past. And I know that Michael Quinlan, were he here today, would applaud this evolution of his own thinking, which of course didn't just embrace nuclear weapons, but embraced other areas such as intelligence and the general management of power. And I think were he here today, he would be smiling down and saying this is exactly the way he would hope that sort of thinking would be evolving as he moves forward. So without more ado, let me hand over to Professor Nye.
With your permission, I will lecture without a coat on. It is a warm room. So, thank you very much, Ken, for the generous introduction. I should say that I should warn you that when my children were growing up and people would call the house and ask, is Dr. Nye there? They'd always say, yes, but he's not the useful kind. And so I'd like to talk to you tonight about what is ethical foreign policy leadership, which is not an easy subject, but I think one appropriate for an honor to Michael. Michael was a man of great kindness and deep thought. I first came to know the first aspect through many congenial meals with Michael and Mary at Ditchley and at their home in Oxfordshire and elsewhere. And I came to know the second characteristic, the deep thought, through reading Michael's work and conversing about his analysis of nuclear weapons and warfare. He certainly influenced my thought as well as that of many more important people. He was always a strong voice of reason, moderation, and moral clarity. As Michael and Charles Guthrie wrote in their book, Just War, moral accountability is a central part of what it means to be a human being. And that's the way Michael lived his life. And that's why I thought it was appropriate to have a lecture in his honor that would address rather difficult topics of ethics and foreign policy leadership. In practice, we often judge ethics in three dimensions. We look at the ends, the means, and the consequences of actions. And by ends, we refer to his intentions, as in his ends were just. And effective means are those which not only achieve the goals, but ethical means depend upon quality, not just the efficacy of the approach that's employed. And as for consequences, a leader's effectiveness involves achieving a group's goals, but ethical consequences mean good results, not just for the in-group, but also for outsiders as well. Of course, in practice, effectiveness and ethics are closely related. A leader who pursues unrealistic goals or uses ineffective means can produce terrible moral consequences for followers. For example, even if we attribute good intentions to George W. Bush's invasion of Iraq, unrealistic goals and inadequate means had immoral consequences. Thus, inadequate contextual intelligence and reckless testing of reality can produce bad consequences which become not merely an ineffective policy, but an ethical failure. Conversely, however, a leader can say great things about intentions, but sometimes it's not followed through, and good intentions are not alone proof of what is sometimes misleadingly called moral clarity. The quality of moral reasoning can be separated from the issue of relativity and ultimate proof. Some people believe that because moral judgments are ultimately relative, they are merely a matter of personal taste, like whether one prefers vanilla or chocolate ice cream. The columnist, the New York Times columnist David Brooks, reported on conversations with many young people that he said make this mistake. And to quote Brooks, he said, reflecting blind deference to authority, many of the young people have gone off the deep end to the other extreme. I would do what I thought would make me happy or how I felt. I have no other way of knowing what to do except how I internally feel. But even if ultimate metaphysically based judgments cannot be proven, it does not follow that all moral reasoning is equal. One can still apply standards of logic, causation, and consistency to judge the quality of moral reasoning. For example, when Laura Schlesinger, a fundamentalist broadcaster, argued that homosexuality is an abomination because Leviticus says so, It could also be pointed out that Leviticus says that one may possess slaves provided they're purchased from neighboring nations. I guess that means that it's all right for British to own French, but not Italians. Or if someone says that nuclear weapons are good because God gave them to us to protect the free world, one can ask why God gave them to North Korea rather than to South Korea. We can apply reason to judge moral arguments even if we cannot always agree on a definitive proof. Now, should leaders be judged by the same moral standards as ordinary citizens? Take the biblical injunction, thou shalt not kill. In choosing a roommate or a spouse, that commandment would rank very high on our list of moral values. At the same time, most people would not vote for an absolute pacifist to become president or prime minister of their country. Presidents and prime ministers have a fiduciary obligation to protect the people who elected them. And under certain circumstances, that may involve ordering troops into battle to take lives. Sometimes leaders must have dirty hands. Max Weber, the famous German sociologist, famously distinguished an ethic of ultimate ends from an ethic of responsibility. And in the former, absolute moral imperatives must not be violated for the sake of good consequences. But for the latter, an ethic of responsibility, the leader must focus on the results. Weber warns that he who seeks the salvation of the soul, his own soul and others, should not seek it along the avenue of politics. In the philosophical traditions of the Western Enlightenment, ethicists distinguish between deontological or rule-based approaches associated with, let's say, Immanuel Kant, from consequentialist approaches that are associated with utilitarians such as Jeremy Bentham or John Stuart Mill. And the two traditions provide important strands of contemporary moral reasoning in the West today, but they're often difficult to reconcile. Take, for example, Harry Truman's decision to drop the atomic bomb on Hiroshima in an effort to end World War II. In a war where millions of lives had already been lost, Truman was told that he could save hundreds of thousands of American and Japanese lives by avoiding a land invasion of the Japanese home islands. Moreover, the numbers killed at Hiroshima and Nagasaki were fewer than those who had been killed in the conventional firebombing of Tokyo or Dresden. Was Truman's act morally justified? Strict deontologists and just war theories would answer that two wrongs do not make a right, and that the deliberate destruction of so many innocent lives can never be justified. On the other hand, some consequentialists could reply that nuclear deterrence helped to prevent World War III, and that Truman later redeemed himself by refusing to use nuclear weapons when General MacArthur urged him to do so in the Korean War, and that contributed to the establishment of a taboo against the use of nuclear weapons. Indeed, that taboo against nuclear use has lasted for nearly 7 decades, and Michael Quinlan did much to reinforce it. Moreover, if Truman had refused to drop the atomic bomb because of his personal moral beliefs, at what price does a leader's concern about personal integrity translate into selfishness and a violation of followers' trust? There are no easy answers to such problems, and recent scientific discoveries suggest that evolution may have wired this dilemma into the human brain. My colleague at Harvard, Kenneth Winston, argues that in daily practice, people's sense of moral obligation tends to come from 3 main sources. One is a sense of conscience, which is personally or religiously informed, and leads individuals to try to achieve a sense of moral integrity. A second involves rules of common morality that society treats as obligations for all individuals. And a third is codes of professional ethics and conventional expectations that might be considered duties that are accompanying one's role. Leaders are subject to all 3 of these demands as they make their moral judgments. And these different sources of moral obligation are frequently in tension with each other. Often there is no single solution. As Isaiah Berlin once noted, and I quote him, "Since the ends of men are many, and not all of them are in principle compatible with each other, then the possibility of conflict and of tragedy can never be wholly eliminated from human life, either personal or social." Now, many societies have ethical systems which stress impartiality and have an analog to the golden rule: do unto others as you would have them do unto yourself. Your interests and my interests should be treated the same way. John Rawls, the great liberal philosopher, used the wonderful metaphor of a veil of ignorance about our initial relative positions to illustrate justice as fairness. In other words, if each of us imagined that he was and she was in the position of the other and didn't know where they stood, what would seem a just solution? However, appealing to an intuitive sense of fairness, treating others as you want to be treated, not playing favorites and being sensible to individual needs, doesn't always provide a solution. Amartya Sen invites us to imagine a parent with a flute and 3 children, each of whom wants it. The first child said, "I made it." The second child says, "I'm the only one who can play it." And the third child says, "I have no other toys." Where does justice lie, even behind a veil of ignorance? So even with a thought experiment about deciding behind a veil of ignorance in which none of the children knows which one is which, the principle of justice as fairness remains unclear in some cases. In such instances, the parent, or the leader, may find it more appropriate to turn to a procedural or institutional solution in which the children bargain with each other, or agree on a lottery, or upon a neutral figure to decide how time with the flute will be allocated or shared. The parent can also teach or coach the children about sharing, which is a different image of leadership as persuasion and education rather than the exercise of command authority. Teaching followers about process and institutions, helping a group decide how to decide, is often one of the most important moral roles that leaders and parents play. We often make moral judgments about how leaders distribute the risks and costs of their actions. Rash assessments of reality that impose high risks on others can be condemned on moral as well as effectiveness grounds. People who try to climb mountains accept a degree of risk, but a team leader still has to make sure that the whole group understands the balance between risk and achievement. It's one thing to pose a grand vision that leads people up a mountain. It's another to lead them too close to the edge of the cliff. I'm going to skip some things so that we'll have lots of time for questions. So let me just skip some things about how and when we judge leaders. But let me say that the other thing that makes it important as we judge leaders to think beyond just individual actions is what sort of institutions they design. One of the most important skills of good leaders is to design and maintain systems and institutions. This relates both to effectiveness and to ethics. Poorly designed institutions are those which fail to achieve a group's purpose, not in each particular instance, but over the long term. Well-designed institutions include means for self-correction as well as ways of constraining the failures of leaders. Poorly designed or led institutions can also lead people astray. Obedience to institutional authority can be bad at times. Several decades ago, there was a famous experiment at Yale University in which students were invited to administer simulated brutal electrical shocks to their colleagues. And a similar experiment in Stanford, called the Stanford Prison Experiment, demonstrated the capacity of intelligent people to submit blindly to authority. And the recent case of Abu Ghraib prison reminds us of both the importance and the danger of poorly designed institutions. The Abu Ghraib guards were reservists without special training who lacked supervision and were given the task of softening up detainees. it's not surprising that the result was various forms of torture. The moral flaws were not simply in the prison guards, but also in the higher level leaders who created and failed to monitor a flawed institutional framework. So good leadership is not merely inspire people with a noble vision, but involves creating and maintaining the systems and institutions that allow effective moral implementation. For example, Ronald Reagan articulated inspiring visions, while George H.W. Bush did not. But Reagan's inattention to institutions produced the Iran-Contra scandal, while Bush's well-organized process avoided potential accidents during the dismantling of the Cold War. Not only are these difficulties about the role of leader in terms of having a fiduciary trust and having to think about other dimensions than we do in making moral choices in our own daily lives, but there also is a set of complications in ethical foreign policy leadership that grows out of the nature of international reality. Basically, when we judge things internationally, we have to ask the question of whether a leader owes duties to those who are beyond his or her national borders. Skeptics argue that there's no sense of community in the world, and therefore there are no moral rights and duties where there's no sense of community, and that the classic statement about ethics in international politics was the Athenian response to the Melians' plea for mercy, which said, "The strong do what they will, and the weak suffer what they must." If international relations were simply the realm of kill or be killed, then presumably there is no choice, and where there's no choice, there would be no rule for morality. But international politics consists of more than mere survival, and pretending choice does not exist is merely a disguised form of choice. While it's weak, there is a degree of international human community, and to think only in terms of narrow national interests is simply smuggling in values without admitting it. A French diplomat once said to me when we were debating the question of the ethics of nuclear deterrence some years back, that what is moral is what is good for France. But he was ducking hard choices about why only French interests should be considered. And the leader who says, "I had no choice," often did have a choice, albeit not a pleasant one. International politics is often called anarchic, where anarchy means without government. But international anarchy does not necessarily mean chaos or total disorder. International affairs lack the discipline of a domestic leviathan, but there are rudimentary practices and institutions that provide enough order to allow some important choices: balance of power, international law and norms, and international organizations. Even in the extreme circumstances of war, law and morality sometimes play a role, as Michael wrote about. The just war doctrine originated in the early Christian church as Augustine and others wrestled with the dilemma that if the good did not fight back, they would perish and only the bad would survive. It became secularized after the 17th century and today provides a broad normative structure that considers all three dimensions that I mentioned earlier: ends, means, and consequences in making moral judgments. So today's moral issues are inescapable for foreign policy leaders in democracy because of the nature of the world, but also because their followers demand it. Basically, a leader who pays no attention to the concerns of others will reach not only problems with his or her own conscience, but with their followers' consciences. The leadership theorist Barbara Kellerman, for example, accuses Bill Clinton of insularity in his leadership when he failed to respond to the genocide in Rwanda in 1994. And Clinton himself has criticized his reactions. Yet had Clinton tried to send American troops, he would have encountered stiff resistance in parts of his administration, the Congress, and public opinion. Particularly after the death of American soldiers in an earlier humanitarian intervention in Somalia, his followers were not ready for another intervention. Clinton has acknowledged that he could have done more to help the UN and other nations to save some of the lives that were lost in Rwanda. But good leaders today are often caught between their cosmopolitan inclinations and their more traditional obligations to followers who elected them. Think for a minute of what you think should be done about Syria. Now, insularity is not an all or nothing moral dimension. In a world in which people are organized in national communities, a purely cosmopolitan ideal is unrealistic. For a leader to say there's an obligation to equalize incomes globally is not a credible obligation. But to say that more should be done to reduce poverty and disease outside of one's own nation can indeed rally national followers. As Kwame Anthony Appiah has put it, "Thou shalt not kill is a test that you take pass-fail, but honor thy father and mother admits of gradations." The same is true of cosmopolitanism versus insularity. We may admire leaders who make efforts to increase their followers' concerns for the consequences of their actions of the outgroup, but it does little good to hold them to an impossible standard whose pursuit could undercut their capacity to remain leaders. How then should we judge the ethics of leaders in foreign policy? They act not in an amoral world, but clearly are acting in Weber's world of non-perfectionist ethics. That leads many to say that the best you can hope for is prudence, prudence as a virtue. In international affairs, where presidents and prime ministers can have such destructive effects, some theorists, like Robert Jackson, make an argument that prudence is a moral as well as an instrumental concept. Or in the words of the international relations theorist Arnold Wolfers, the best one can hope for in judging the ethics of leaders in foreign policy is they made the best moral choices that circumstances permit. But that's a necessary, not a sufficient standard, because how do we know what were the best decisions that circumstances would permit? Such a broad rule of prudence can be easily abused. At the same time, it does not imply amorality. What are some of the ways we can reason about whether leaders did indeed make the best moral choices under the circumstances? When we look at the goals, the ends that leaders seek, we do not expect them to pursue justice similar to the way they pursue justice in their domestic societies. After all, even John Rawls, with his veil of ignorance, believed that the conditions for his theory of justice applied only to domestic society. Nonetheless, Rawls argued that duties beyond borders for a liberal society should include mutual aid to others, respect for rights and institutions that ensure basic human rights, while allowing people in a diverse world to determine their own affairs as much as possible. Thus, I think a criteria that we can add to the general criteria of prudence is this idea that a leader has a vision which expresses widely attractive values at home and abroad, but prudently balances those values and assesses risks so there's a reasonable prospect of their success. Note also that that comes from just war theory. This means we judge a leader not only on his or her character and intentions, but also on their contextual intelligence when it comes to assessing the goals they set. Regarding the means, I would say we include criteria that can be borrowed directly from just war theory, such as proportionality and discrimination in the use of force, as well as Rawls' liberal concern for minimal degrees of intervention in order to respect the rights and institutions of others. And as for consequences in an ethical sense, I think we should judge whether leaders succeeded in promoting long-term national interests, whether they respected cosmopolitan values by avoiding extreme insularity, and whether they educated their followers to try to create and broaden moral standards at home and abroad. While this is not a complete list, it does take us at least a few steps beyond the general argument that prudence is sufficient. Let me illustrate it with two recent American presidents. first Ronald Reagan and then George H.W. Bush. Reagan is often cited as the exemplar of a moral foreign policy leader par excellence. A movement conservative, he's remembered for speeches that issued a strong call for moral clarity at Westminster in 1982, where he predicted that the spread of freedom would leave Marxism-Leninism on the ash heap of history. In Florida in 1983, when he called the Soviet Union an evil empire. In Berlin in 1987, when he demanded Mr. Gorbachev tear down that wall. As The Economist put it, Reagan's appeal rested on knowing that mere reason, essential though it is only half the business of reaching momentous decisions. You also need solid-based instincts, feelings, and whatever the word is for the other part of the mind. I have a gut feeling, Reagan said over and over. Yet Reagan was not as simple as he made himself out to be. He was a true believer who lacked the usual personality defects of the type, a sectarian with an ecumenical style. Like Franklin Roosevelt, Reagan lacked a first-class intellect, but he made up for it with a first-class temperament. He radiated optimism and illustrated the point that style can sometimes influence substance. As my colleague David Gergen observes, Reagan changed how we think about ourselves. At the same time, he could be so dreamy and inattentive to detail that he allowed dramatic mistakes to occur. When people today call for a Reaganite foreign policy, and we're hearing more and more such calls as the American election campaign progresses, they think that a Reaganite foreign policy means moral clarity that went with Reagan's simplification of complex issues and his effective rhetoric in the presentation of values. Not only is this an inadequate moral reasoning for the reasons that I explained earlier, it's one-dimensional, but it also mistakes the success of Reagan's moral leadership, which included the ability to bargain and compromise as he pursued his policy. For example, when asked at the 1988 Moscow summit whether he still considered the Soviet Union to be an evil empire, Reagan replied that, "I was talking about another time in another era, not your fanatic movement conservative." Nonetheless, clear and clearly stated objectives can educate and motivate the public. And the key question is whether Reagan was prudent in balancing aspirations and risks in his goals and objectives. Some people have argued that his initial rhetoric in his first term created a dangerous degree of tension and distrust in U.S.-Soviet relations that increased the prospect of a miscalculation or accident leading to war. But it also created incentives to bargain, which Reagan put to good advantage when Gorbachev came to power in Reagan's second term. As for insularity, Reagan expressed his values in universal terms, though he was sometimes accused of hypocrisy for focusing on Soviet violations of human rights while ignoring the violations perpetrated by a number of American third world client regimes. He was quite prepared to live with apartheid in South Africa, and it took him 2 years after the first protests before he reduced his support for the Marcos regime in the Philippines. As for means, Reagan had a mixed record. The circumvention of legal means during the Iran-Contra issue set a bad precedent in terms of domestic as well as international norms and institutions. And the Reagan doctrine of using covert action to fight wars against leftist regimes in Central America not only raised legal issues with the Congress, but also included the mining of harbors in Nicaragua, a country with which the United States was officially at peace. Whether these transgressions of autonomy and institutional restraints was justified by realist necessity is debatable, but the damage was real. As for consequences, Reagan undoubtedly advanced the national interests of the United States, though most of the credit for ending the Cold War in the Soviet Union really belongs to Gorbachev. In any event, Reagan took good advantage of the opportunity in a matter that was not limited just to insular American interests. On other issues, such as placing Marines in Lebanon and then withdrawing them when they were attacked or bargaining for the return of hostages, some analysts argue that he set bad precedents for dealing with terrorism that had unfortunate long-term consequences. Reagan's moralistic rhetoric broadened moral discourse at home and abroad, but it was sometimes subverted by actions such as support for apartheid in South Africa that appeared hypocritical in terms of the values that Reagan proclaimed for himself and for his country. By and large, Reagan had an ethical foreign policy in the goals he set and most of the larger consequences to which he contributed, but not always in terms of the means he used. I'm going to skip George H.W. Bush again with an eye on the clock. We can come back to him if you want, but I'll just say in short form that I rate him as probably one of the best ethical foreign policy leaders. But I want to get to the conclusion, which is how do we judge a good foreign policy leader? Leadership theorists distinguish between transformational leaders with inspirational style who make great changes and what they call transactional leaders who merely keep the trains running on time. And there's a general preference among theorists for transformational leaders. I find very little evidence that would suggest that transformational and inspirational leaders are better at foreign policy than transactional leaders. Indeed, as I suggested a minute ago, I think the best record in American foreign policy in the last century goes to the incremental and transactional George H.W. Bush, and the poorest records belong to some of the transformational and inspirational leaders like his son. September 11, 2001 led to a great transformation in American foreign policy. George W. Bush started as a limited realist with little interest in foreign policy, but became transformational in his objectives after the crisis. Like Woodrow Wilson, Franklin Roosevelt, Harry Truman, and others, George W. Bush turned the rhetoric of democracy to rally his followers in a time of crisis. His 2002 national security strategy, which came to be called the Bush Doctrine, proclaimed that the United States would identify and eliminate terrorists wherever they are, together with the regimes that sustain them. In this new game, there were no rules. The solution to the roots of the terrorist problem was to spread democracy everywhere. In the words of the Yale historian John Gaddis, it is Fukuyama plus force, and designed to make terrorism as obsolete as slavery or piracy. And Iraq was simply the most feasible place to strike the next blow. Now, this is not the place to rehearse the problems of the Iraq War. Bush invaded Iraq ostensibly to change the regime and remove Saddam Hussein's capacity to use weapons of mass destruction. Bush cannot be blamed for the intelligence failure that attributed such weapons to Saddam, since such estimates were widely shared by many other countries. And while no weapons were found, American forces quickly overthrew Saddam. But the removal of Saddam did not accomplish the mission. An inadequate understanding of the context, plus poor planning and management, undercut Bush's transformational objectives. Despite the shared genes, the policy of George W. Bush could not have been more different from that of his father. Members of the younger Bush's administration often compared him to Ronald Reagan or Harry Truman, but the 20th century president that he reminds me most of was Woodrow Wilson. There are uncanny similarities between Woodrow Wilson and George W. Bush. Both were highly religious and moralistic men who were elected with less than the majority of the popular vote and initially focused on domestic issues without any vision in foreign policy. Both were initially successful in their transformational domestic agendas in the Congress. Both tended to portray the world in black and white rather than shades of gray, and both projected great self-confidence, responding to a crisis with a bold vision, and they stuck to it. Although he possessed a master's degree in business administration, George W. Bush displayed some of the same organizational deficiencies that Woodrow Wilson showed in managing the government and sorting out conflicting information that he received. Again, this was in contrast to the successful management style of his father. As described by David Gergen, George W. Bush is a top-down, no-nonsense, decisive, macho leader who sets his eye on the far horizon and doesn't go wobbly getting there. But strength of character is not an adequate substitute for organizational competence, such as Bush's father possessed. Information flows were limited, and as former Secretary of State Colin Powell has reported of Bush, he knows what kind of thing he wants to do, and he wants to hear just how to get it done. The younger Bush was decisive and persistent, but like Wilson, not very receptive to new information once his mind was made up. Though Wilson started as an idealist and Bush as a realist, both wound up stressing the promotion of democracy and freedom in the rest of the world as their transformative vision. And both defined visions that had a very large gap between the expressed ideals and the national capacities. Indeed, many of Bush's speeches, particularly his secular inaugural address about a freedom agenda, sounded like they could have been uttered by Woodrow Wilson. Both Wilson and Bush tried to educate the public to accept their transformational visions. But as a political scientist, Hugh Heclo has argued, successful teaching requires ongoing learning on the teacher's part. Bush's impatience hindered learning. In the words of a journalist who spent many hours with him, Bush has a transformational temperament. He likes to shake things up. That was the key to going into Iraq. That impatient temperament also contributed to the organizational process that Bush put in place that discouraged learning. In his second term, Bush made some efforts to change the debate on Iraq by publicly acknowledging new flags, and he pressed hard for his surge of additional troops. But in practice, he was not able to prevent an ultimate defeat. Now, Wilson initially succeeded in educating a majority of the American people about his League of Nations, but he failed because he refused to make compromises with the American Senate. Similarly, Bush was initially able to persuade the American people of his proposed transformation of American strategy. He was re-elected in 2004, but he lost support in the Congress by 2006. The comparison illustrates the prospects for transformational leadership in foreign policy are greatest in a time of crisis, but even then, success requires a combination of soft power skills to attract people at home and abroad with a feasible vision, and hard organizational and political skills to implement the vision. As I said earlier, there's little evidence to support the general assumptions of leadership theory that transformational and inspirational foreign policy leaders are better in either ethics or effectiveness. For one thing, the concept of transformational leadership is too ambiguously defined to be useful unless it's more carefully specified. But even with objectives distinguished from style, the evidence does not support the view that leaders with transformational objectives and inspirational style are better. Other leadership skills that I outlined in my book on the powers to lead are more important than the usual distinction between transformational and transactional leaders. And here it's useful to compare Woodrow Wilson not with George W. Bush, but with George H.W. Bush, the first Bush. In the long term, Wilson's vision was partially vindicated, but he lacked the leadership skills needed for its execution and implementation in his own time. With George H.W. Bush, the vision thing, as he called it, and his educational impact were very limited, but his execution and management were very good. Perhaps the facetious moral of this story is that at some mythical day in the future, genetic engineering will be able to produce leaders equally endowed with both sets of skills. But comparing the two Bushes who shared half their genes makes it clear that nature has not yet solved the problem. This is not an argument against transformational leaders, nor is this an argument against transformational leaders in foreign policy. But in judging leaders, we need to pay attention to both acts of omission and acts of commission, both things that happened and things that did not happen, dogs that barked and those that did not. A big problem in foreign policy is the complexity of the context. We live in a world of diverse cultures and know very little about social engineering and how to, in quote, build nations. When we cannot be sure how to improve the world, then prudence becomes an important virtue, and hubristic visions can pose a grave danger. In foreign policy, as in medicine, it's important to remember the Hippocratic Oath. First, do no harm. For these reasons, the virtues of transactional leaders with good contextual intelligence are very important. A George H.W. Bush without the ability to articulate a vision, but who's able to steer successfully through crises, turns out to be a better leader than a George W. Bush with a powerful vision but little contextual intelligence. To summarize this, in trying to explain the role of a Secretary of State, George Shultz, Reagan's former Secretary of State, once compared it to gardening. He called it the constant nurturing of a complex array of actors' interests and goals. But Shultz's Stanford colleague, Condoleezza Rice, who was the second Bush's Secretary of State, wanted a more transformational diplomacy, in not accepting the world as it is, but trying to change it. Rice's ambition, as one observer put it, was not just to be a gardener like Shultz. She wanted to be a landscape architect. There's a role for both, depending on the context, but we should avoid the common mistake of automatically thinking that transformational landscape architects are better and more ethical foreign policy leaders than careful gardeners. Prudence can be a crucial virtue in foreign policy, as Michael Quinlan frequently reminded us. Thank you very much.
Well, that was absolutely wonderful. And I must say, I think injecting this thought about organizational competence and contextual intelligence as a very important ethical principle in leadership is well worth reinforcing. And I couldn't help thinking about the Blair years sometimes as you were talking, but perhaps I should
I was careful not to trespass. I didn't mention Thatcher or Blair.
Right. Now, we have 20 minutes for questions. People are there at the back with mics. Somebody has got microphones. Could you indicate who you are, put up your hands, the mic will come round, and we'll begin the questioning now. And I notice you left nice gaps for us to ask about another Bush, and I'm sure people will want to. But George H.W. Bush is a most interesting man, and I hope we have more about that. Mm-hmm. Hand at the back there.
Thank you very much, Professor Nye, for your lecture. I was just wondering if you could perhaps illustrate a little bit the point, the arguments that your mode of analysis by telling us a little bit more about what you would do about Syria, as you invited us to do during the lecture, thinking in terms of intention, consequences, and ends and means and consequences. Is that something that you perhaps could defer to?
It's a very good question, a very hard question. And I shouldn't answer it because John Holmes is going to answer it at Ditchley this weekend. But being serious about it, I think one of the first things, if you take the import of what I said, is you ask, how do I make sure I don't make things worse? I mean, Assad is detestable. I wrote a piece in the Financial Times over a year ago urging sanctions against Assad, and so forth. But in a community that is split between different religions, you have to ask, would a overthrow of Assad, for example, if you fed a lot of arms into Syria, would you wind up with Baghdad after Saddam Hussein? And I think until you have some idea of whether there is something worse than Assad, namely a religious civil war, you ought to be careful about how you do this. So if you take the thrust of what I was saying about the virtue of prudence, which of course really does come from just war theory, the reasonable prospect for success, I would be quite cautious about Syria, about what I would do. I would continue to try various forms of moral suasion, pressure, isolation. I tried to get the Russians to allow a resolution through the Security Council that might reinforce the Turks setting up a humanitarian zone on the border. I mean, there are a lot of things that you can do besides just saying it's tough, sit on your hands. But I don't think I would use armed intervention unless I knew that the net effect was going to be better rather than worse. And I don't think I can make that statement now. But also, I don't know. Yep.
The lady down here on the fourth row, fifth row.
Sorry, it's not on. Yeah. Yeah. Okay.
It's okay now? I have actually two questions or two thoughts I would like to perhaps draw you on to talk about. And I'll start with the second one. Increasingly nowadays, foreign policy endeavors and conflict resolution seldom involve single countries. And because they involve coalitions, I wonder what your thoughts and how does the skills, leadership skills in coalition building fit into your dichotomous model of transactional versus transformational leadership. And the second one, which you talked about in the early part of your presentation, was on institutions. And I think you mentioned institutional design and leaders picking the right institutions. I would like to draw you up on this a little bit more. What do you mean by institutions? What is the difference between the means and institutions? And also there was always a potential for elite manipulation of institutions. So have you got any thoughts on that in terms of foreign policy?
Well, on the first question about the need for coalitions, I think what you're seeing is a world in which very few things can be solved solely by one country, even a country as powerful as the US. And I think what that means is that an effective foreign policy leader and an ethical foreign policy leader has to ask, how do you create collective action? Let me use the example of Libya and Obama's actions on Libya. When it looked like Gaddafi would be slaughtering many citizens of Libya, there was very strong pressure from the American Senate, Senators McCain, Lieberman, and others, that we should immediately use force. No time to lose. People are dying immediately. Obama basically said, if I do this, then the narrative, which will echo from Morocco to Indonesia, is the United States invades or bombs third Muslim country in a row. Whereas if you wait, and he waited until he had an Arab League resolution and a UN resolution, then you could use force, and the narrative was US and NATO force is used to implement the UN's responsibility to protect. Now, there are lots of problems with Libya. It's not a perfect example, but what I would point out is that it was a good case of what you might call smart power, the combination of soft power, making sure you got the narrative right, as well as hard power, making sure that you were able to use force. And in the use of force also, even though the Americans may have provided a disproportionate number of the bombs and other aspects, but doing it in a coalition format. So I think Libya is an example of that. And I think one of the problems, to go back to the first question about Syria, is you don't have those conditions in Syria. On your second question on institutions, I would refer to institutions both domestically and internationally. And I did cut out large chunks of what I was going to say, but let me then use that to bring in George H.W. Bush. George H.W. Bush set up an institutional framework in which ideas came to him from very strong-minded people, but always his national security counselor, Brent Scowcroft, always made sure that he was getting these different views. His son basically let if you want, the Secretary of Defense and the Secretary and the Vice President have a special channel, which meant that certain information didn't get to him or didn't get equal treatment. That's an institutional domestic failure. George H.W. Bush made great efforts to make sure that he had a UN resolution for the Gulf War, and also to create a very broad coalition that included countries like Syria to defeat Saddam Hussein. Now, did George H.W. Bush need Syria to defeat Saddam Hussein? Absolutely not. It was probably more of an impediment in military terms than an asset. But he knew that you wanted a very broad coalition for legitimacy, that he needed the soft power that came from having significant Arab states participating and not just doing it in quotes alone. So the father, the first Bush, very smart about institutions, both in the domestic sense and in the international sense. The son, less so.
I think John Holmes.
It's very nice to be here as one of Michael Quinlan's successors and listen to you, Joe. A very quick question. I won't invite you to stray out of the US, but you didn't say much, if anything, about Clinton or Obama. Where would you put them on your spectrum from transformational to transactional and from ethical to non-ethical, if you can put it that way?
Well, I served in the Clinton administration, so I have a certain conflict of interest. I think Clinton often used transformational language, but was quite transactional in its approach. I mean, he would talk about enlargement of democracy, enlargement and engagement. But if you ask, did he take major actions that were transformational? Not really. So I think but from my point of view, that's not bad per se. But it's just that in categorizing him, I would say he was often inspirational in style. He's a great rhetorician, but he was not transformational in terms of the vision or the aspirations that he had. It's interesting, Obama comes into office talking about the need for transformation and then can't do it because basically he inherits a tremendous economic crisis, which if he hadn't put that top of his list would have absorbed all other attention and energy. And he basically he does certain things of creating or reinforcing the group of 20 and so forth, but I would not say that his foreign policy has been transformational. He's actually been fairly cautious, fairly prudent, as witnessed the way he handled Libya.
I mean, would you say there's a sort of secular trend here that, talking about leadership in the conventional political leadership sense, that over the years, leaders have less and less grip on levers that actually are linked to machinery than used to be the case in the past? That they are less and less capable of implementing their visions, which has an obvious implication for ethical success?
I think that's true up to a point, but it is worth looking at the killing of bin Laden. It was conventional wisdom that, everything leaks, everything is out immediately, you can't keep any secrets, you can't mount an operation like you could in the good old days. Well, I'm sorry, we did. Now, what that took was an extraordinary managerial skills, which is, if you look at the account that is in Graham Allison wrote in Time magazine about using a narrow circle of people and then gradually expanding the circle, it did work. They were able to pull off quite a remarkable operation without leaking. And it would see, I take your general point, Kevin, but we don't want to make it an absolute rule. I mean, I think you can still do certain things.
Gentleman in the middle there, there we are.
Thank you. If I can begin with a bit of shameless promotion, just to let everyone know, in case they aren't aware, that the Islam and the West Forum Queen Mary's meeting in this very room in exactly 1 week to discuss the Syrian crisis and what the reaction to it might or should be from the international community. On a somewhat related issue, I wondered if I could draw you a little bit on context, moral context, because it's a lot easier to be ethical if everyone's playing by the same rules. And you presented, but with your use of frequent references to just war theory, you presented quite a Christocentric view of the rules of engagement. And I wondered if you might elaborate on the reality of the applicability of that in terms of relations with, say, the Muslim world or with China, who you haven't mentioned so far, and whether you think those rules of engagement are going to be, there's going to be consensus around them, and whether they're going to stay the same or fluctuate in the coming decades.
Well, I think you're absolutely correct. The just war theory has Christian origins, but I think it's actually become quite secularized. I mean, it still is an important tradition of the Christian church, but if you look at the Uniform Code of Military Justice, which is a totally secular code, in other words, if you're an American soldier and you are Jewish or Hindu or whatever, you are subject to the Uniform Code of Military Justice, and that's based very much on just war theory. So I think you can make an argument that what starts as a Christian doctrine has become much broader. And the other aspect, and so there are some scholars who would argue that in the Muslim traditions, the idea of killing or taking innocent life is also prohibited, which gives you an overlap with one of the key principles in just war theory. So I don't think the prospects for some moral consensus are internationally are quite that dim. Then there's also the question of prudence. When you talk about China, for example, I was just in China a few weeks ago. Some people say, well, you know, when China rules the world, to quote the name of a book by Martin Jacques, China will impose Chinese rules on the world, and you know, then all this Western stuff will be gone. Maybe 30 years, but you know, that's the way the world will be. There's an alternative view which has been expressed by the Princeton scholar John Eikenberry, but many others, and I express it in my book on the future of power. It says the liberal international institutions that were created after 1945 are remarkably open for others to participate in. And look at what's happened with China. When the United States made a decision in the 90s not to try to contain China, but to invite China into the World Trade Organization, it was enormously important. China now has a huge stake in the preservation of the WTO. And China does have an inherited stake in the UN Security Council where it has a veto. So the fact, and taking it one step further, with the International Monetary Fund, there was an agreement in the G20 that Europe would reduce some of its quota of votes in the IMF and redistribute them to China. If these international institutions are open to that degree, and if they have these enormous benefits to China and India and Brazil and others, then I think this view that when China rules the world, we're going to have a totally different system may not be true. And that would be based on an ethic of if you want, prudence and avoiding insularity.
Now, time pressure affects leaders making up their minds, and it affects us too. We have 3 or 4 minutes and 3 questions. So the first one, very quickly, a gentleman in the 4th row here.
Hi, my name is Tim Bale from University of Sussex and soon to be Queen Mary University of London. I would like to ask if there is any evidence that a transactional Secretary of State can hold back a transformational president, whether there's any evidence to suggest that a transformational Secretary of State can actually do the vision thing or help the transactional president with the vision thing.
Yeah, that's a very interesting question. Generally, the president makes the running, and the Secretary of State adjusts to the president or he or she is not going to remain Secretary of State for long. So in the American system, there isn't equality in the cabinet. There is a very clear dominance of the president. But you can think back to secretaries of state like Dean Acheson, who took a initially transactional Truman and helped Truman learn how to become a transformational president. So that's a rare example.
Lady in the corner here, on the right.
Hi, I'm Sandra, and I'm doing a PhD here at Queen Mary on nuclear proliferation, nuclear program in Brazil, and I would like you to know your opinion. What would be the ethical solution when dealing with the nuclear program in Iran?
Nuclear program in
Iran, and whether the United States, they have the morality to stop Iran.
Well, if you ask, it's a little bit like my point about, some people say, God gave us nuclear weapons, but then why did he give them to the others? It's not that the Americans or British or others have a God-given right to nuclear weapons. Your reasoning on this would have to be consequentialist, which would be what would be the implications of in Iran with nuclear weapons. Is it more or less likely that a lot of people would die because of the use of nuclear weapons? So the ultimate immorality here is nuclear use. And I think you can make a case, a reasonable case, that could be done behind a veil of ignorance, if you want, that a country like Iran gaining nuclear weapons would increase the probability of nuclear use. That's why I hope that the outcome of the talks that began in Baghdad today will be that there will be a bargain struck in which the Iranians will say what Khamenei, the supreme religious leader, has said, that having nuclear weapons would be immoral for Iran. And if the Iranians were to follow that principle from the supreme leader and to agree to not enrich uranium beyond 3% and to export their 20% enriched uranium, in return for which they would get relaxation of the sanctions, to me that would be a good deal. Not everybody agrees with that, but that would be my view.
Now, Michael Quinlan would not be surprised if, as he looks down, I give the last question to a man of the cloth. Bishop, it's yours.
Richard Harries, various organisations. Reinhold Niebuhr seems to have made a bit of a comeback in recent years, and as you know in particular, he's been something of an influence on Barack Obama. Is that an influence likely to be helpful or unhelpful in the terms of formation of foreign policy?
Oh, I think Niebuhr is very helpful in terms of the conceptual framework of foreign policy. So I think Obama's what you might call prudence and treating prudence as a virtue, not merely a convenience, is very much Niebuhrian. But it's also true that in terms of politics, people don't remember Reinhold Niebuhr. I mean, there's no political gain. It's really the mental apparatus. But in terms of mental apparatus, I think it's a big plus.
Well, I'm afraid the organisers tell me we now have to draw it to an end. But I hope you will agree with me that this is exactly what we hoped the second lecture would be about, a very clear enunciation of principles, of moral values, of ethics, woven round the history of the last 50 years or so, particularly in the United States. You're very gracious not to have pulled our own politicians into this. I'm not sure they would have come out any better. In fact, I have a feeling that one or two of them would have come out worse. And unfortunately, we didn't have a Brent Scowcroft in the UK to manage our own National Security Council at certain critical moments. But anyway, I hope you'll join me in thanking Professor Nye for what has been a fascinating and very valuable.
Kevin.